So before I begin, just a quick disclaimer. I am not a legal expert. I know a lot about how to handle PI data and be GDPR compliant, but I'm not an attorney at law. I haven't studied law, so the information here is really just high level and meant as a service for you guys, how to be GDPR compliant. It is your responsibility as a company processing PI data that you are GDPR compliant, so we do advise you to seek professional legal counsel as well. With that being said, I can give you some tips on how to use PI software in a GDPR compliant manner. So just quickly on the GDPR, it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU set of laws that require businesses to protect the data of anyone living in the EU, whether they're EU citizens or not, anyone living in the EU, and also EU citizens living outside the EU. The GDPR also regulates the exportation of personal data outside of the EU. So if data is transferred outside the EU borders, the GDPR also regulates how that data is protected in that context. The Predictive Index is an American company, so data is transferred and stored in the US, but the GDPR specify very strict laws that protect the way that data is handled and transferred, and the Predictive Index, of course, comply with all those laws. Just a quick note on the different types of data. In the GDPR, there's a we distinguish between personal data and sensitive personal data. And I just want to stress that the data in PI software is not sensitive personal data. Sensitive personal data would be something like religion, ethnicity, medical data, sexuality, gender. And of course, we don't store any data like that in PI software. So it's considered personal data, but not sensitive personal data. Different parties. So the Predictive Index is what we call the main data processor. Your agreement for the PI subscription, the PI product, is with the Predictive Index. It's actually not with Humanostics. We're your day-to-day consultant and PI certified partner. But your agreement is actually with the Predictive Index in the US. But we are what we call a data sub-processor. Your company is what we call the data controller because you control the data. A data processor agreement should be in place between you and all your suppliers, including the Predictive Index. And they have a standard DPA or data processing agreement that we've shared with someone in your company just recently because there was a new version. We've reached out to all our clients and informed them of this new DPA. So if you have any question in that regard, someone in your company is probably already looking at it, but you're of course welcome to reach out in any case. So your organization, you have some obligations. So you should have a data privacy policy in place that specifies a lot of things, but in PI, when related to PI, it should specify what data you store, so PI data, how long you will store it, what you're going to use it for, and so on. And you need to communicate this to your candidates and employees and all your assessment takers. And you can set up a process. You have to set up a process to be sure that you delete old data when you're not allowed to store it anymore. So the law basically says you can store data for as long as you need it and as long as you say you will store it for. So for employees, you can store the data as long as they're employed. For candidates, you can only store it for as long as you need it. And that usually means after you make a hiring decisions, the people that you don't choose to hire, that you cannot keep their data forever. And it's to specify how long you intend to keep it after a hiring process, for instance. Also, employees who leave your organization, former employees, you're not allowed to store that data forever. So you have to have a process in place to make sure that you delete that data. And PI software can be set up to anonymize data automatically, and I'll get back to that later in this webinar. So a few things in PI software, practical advice on how to set up the software. Some of you are probably from smaller companies with only maybe a couple of PI software users, and some of you are from larger organizations where you have a lot of software users. So especially for larger organizations, well, basically any organization where you have software users that don't need to have access to all the data you have in your account, you can restrict the access to PI data You should only have access to the data that's relevant for you. So if you have, let's say, 10 PI software users who work for different functions or departments or geographies, it's a very good idea that you as administrators set up a folder structure in PI software and then restrict who has access to what data. So this basically, it should be done whatever makes sense for your company. It could be based on geography. So if you have different countries or branches, could be based on function or department, whatever makes sense for your organization. You can set up the folder hierarchy in any way you please, and you can have as many subfolder levels as you wish. And then once you've set up the different folders, you can go into each folder and then grant access to the software users that need access to that set of data. If you grant access to a folder, you also grant access to its subfolders. So access is inherited from the folder above. And software users will only be able to see the folders that they have been granted access to. There are 2 exceptions to that. If you're an account admin or account owner, so the user role is called account admin and account owner, you automatically have access to all data in the for those roles, you cannot restrict access to data. So you have to be mindful of that when you grant the user role to new software users. Secondly, the top folder or the root folder, that's the one at the top that has your company name. Here it says Humanostics Demo. This folder, everyone has access to that. So data stored in the root folder will be visible to every software user. You cannot restrict access to the root folder. And for this reason, it's of course important if you're a larger organization that you don't store data in the root folder, because everyone will be able to see it. When you go into the administration module in folder management, the folder management tab, you can see at the bottom, by clicking on each folder, you can see at the bottom who has access to that folder. So it will be shown in blue like this. It will have the names of the software users that have been granted access to that folder. And below that, it will say who has inherited access from a higher level in the folder hierarchy. So when you send out assessments, any software user that sends out assessments, the data has to be stored in a folder, and everyone has a default folder set up in the software. This is something that you set up when you create users, and you can always change it, of course. And it's the default folder, that's where data will be stored unless they manually change it to another folder. And if you have a lot of users, it's important that this folder is not the top folder, not the root folder with your company name, because again, everyone can see data stored in that folder. So it's a good idea for you to go into the software. You have a lot of users, click on each user, check what their default folder is, and make sure it's not the top folder. So you set up the default folder, but the software user can still change it to another folder if they have access to another folder, of course, when they send out assessments. So when categorizing individuals in the software, you do this when you send out assessment invitations. You're asked to choose between candidate, employee, and other. This is, of course, important because it gives you a good overview of what type of individual each person is. And it's important that you not only choose the right category when you create the person or send out the invitation, but also if it's a candidate and you choose to hire them, go in and change their status from candidate to employee. And if someone leaves your organization, go in and change it from employee to other or back to candidate if you wish. So this can be done on the person page. You click on someone's name in the software, you get to their person page. That's where you download all their reports. And there's a little pencil icon next to their name. You can change the status there. So this is important, of course, for you to have a good overview of your data, but also because you can set up the software to automatically anonymize old candidate data and former employee data for you. So instead of you having to manually remember to go in and anonymize an individual that you don't hire or someone who leaves your company, the software can actually be set up to do it for you. So checking once every day to see any old candidate data and employee data, and then anonymize it for you. This is a great way for you to lessen your own admin burden and make sure that you are GDPR compliant. It's up to you and whatever your privacy policy says, how long you store this data. So it has to specify in your privacy policy, we keep candidate data for this long. And of course, you have to comply with that. So that differs a lot from company to company. For some, it's a very short time, maybe 3 months, 90 days. In other companies, it's up to 5 years. So whatever your company privacy policy says, you should comply with that when you set up automatic anonymization in the software. So in this case, I've chosen 180 days. You go into the administration module, click on company settings, scroll down to anonymize people data. Then there's one called bulk anonymized by type. And you tick the 4 boxes here, and then you choose every day in the how often drop-down menu. And then you set the number of days that you wish for data to be stored for. And this basically means that every day the system will go in and look for candidate or other individuals. So anyone who's not categorized as an employee. And if their assessment data is older than 180 days, that record will automatically be anonymized. And when I say anonymized, I really mean deleted, and deleted in a way that cannot be restored, not by you, not by us, not by the predictive index. So anonymized means gone forever. If you are a company you have already had a lot of data in your software account and you want to set this automatic anonymization up, it's a very good idea for you to do a thorough cleanup of your data before you click this button, because once you do it, there's no going back. So I would advise you to go through all your folders, all your data, make sure all individuals are categorized correctly. So all employees are categorized as employees, and anyone who's not an employee is categorized as something else, candidate or other. It's important to note that the software doesn't care what the folder, what the name of the folder is. So if you have someone stored in a folder called employees, it doesn't matter when you look at anonymization what the name of the folder is. It only looks at the status or the type of the individual. So that's why it's very important, as I just showed you, to remember to change the category of each individual, because that's what the software looks at. It doesn't care what the folder name is. So as software admins, you are the ones who set up all this in PI software. That means it's also your responsibility to inform any other software users of how they should be GDPR compliant. So what I've just told you, how to categorize data, store data in folders, but also if you set up automatic anonymization, it's important that you tell them how long are we storing data for. It's not rare that we get calls from software users in larger companies that are not aware of how their admins have set up the software, and suddenly their data is gone and they didn't know why. So it's very important that you, as software admins, inform your other software users of how you've set up the software, and also if you make any changes to the process. So of course, when you create a new software users, you should inform them of your process, and also if you make any changes to those processes. For instance, enabling an automatic anonymization. We've created a template document for you that I will share with you afterwards, that you can fill in with your sort of company-specific details, for instance, how long you store data. And you can send that out to all your software users. It has step-by-step guides and screenshots on how they can be GDPR compliant in the software. So as I've said earlier, it's important, you're obliged by law, obligated by law to inform your candidates and employees how you store data, how you handle data. And you can do this in different ways. It should be specified in your company privacy policy. How you share that with your candidates and employees is really up to you. You could have a link on your website, you can send it in an email, whatever your company process usually is. But if you want, you can also have it included in the email invitations that go out from PI software. So you can go into the administration module, company settings, and there's a section called software email settings. And in here, you can choose each of the emails that will go out from PI software, and then you can customize what it says. So there's room for putting in a message there about how you handle data. It's different from company to company what they put in there if they use this template, but usually it has a link to the company privacy policy. Sometimes it has information that is in the privacy policy. For instance, we're asking you to complete this assessment because you're applying for a position, and the process is this and that. Some companies have a longer text, and some just have a link to their privacy policy. It's really up to you, but you as admins can go in and customize each of these emails that go out from the software. It's important to note that you can choose a different email. So two of the most important ones are probably take the behavioral assessment and take the cognitive assessments. So those are the invitations to complete assessments. And you have to remember that you have to, if you put in a link to privacy policy here, you have to do it for each language that you send out assessments in. So maybe your software defaults in English, then if you put it in here, it will be included in the English email. But as you probably know, we have assessments available in 65 and 68 languages. So we also have email invitations in as many languages. And if you have other software users that send out in, let's say, French or Portuguese, then you have to include that information in the email template there as well. So there's a drop-down menu for language. Then you can change the language, change the message for each of the languages. Now, if you don't speak all of these languages, you can just choose to put in the link, or you can put in the text in English. It's really up to you. You don't have to put anything in here, of course. It's really up to you. It's just an extra service for you if you want to have that included in the email invitations from the software. So according to GDPR laws, individuals own their own data. So this means that when someone fills in an assessment, the assessment data is owned by the individual. Even you're controlling it and processing it, it's owned by the individual. And when they complete an assessment, they give their consent to how you handle their data. So you know this from other places as well. You have to give consent to, yes, we will store your data and all that. In the GDPR, we distinguish between implicit and explicit consent. Implicit consent means that by clicking the link to start the assessment taker agrees to your privacy policy. This is sufficient to be GDPR compliant, so it's enough that it's implicit. They don't actually say, yes, I agree, but they just click the assessment and click the link to begin, and then they implicitly agree to your privacy policy. There is, however, a functionality if you want to enable explicit consent. There's a little box, again, in company settings. Under assessment settings, you can enable the consent function, and then you can put in a message there. The message you put in will be shown when someone clicks to start the behavioral assessment, and then before they can start the actual assessment in the instructions page, they will say whatever message you put in, and then they will have to tick a little box before they can start the assessment. So that's explicit consent. The message could be, for instance, I hereby accept X company's privacy policy, which can be found at this link. This function is only available for the behavioral assessment, so not for the cognitive. So they will only see it when they start the behavioral assessment. But in most cases, people complete the behavioral assessment first and then the cognitive, because that email goes out first. So you can, if you want to enable this, you can put in the message, this consent goes for both assessments, if you wish. So that was it for PI software. I've told you something about how to handle data in PI software in a GDPR compliant manner. You have to be mindful of how you store PI data outside the software. So many of you have HRI systems where maybe you store data there as well. Some companies have software integrations that automatically transfer data to and from PI software. But maybe you download reports from time to time. Maybe you email reports to someone, to the person themselves, or to a hiring manager. Maybe you store them on a shared drive or a Dropbox or whatever. You have to be mindful of where you store the data, because that will also have to be deleted at some point if it's a candidate who's not hired, or if it's an employee who leaves your organization. So remember where you store reports and PI data, and remember to go and delete them there manually. Of course, we cannot set up a process for that. What you can do, however, is if you want to email assessment results to the assessment taker, you can do it from PI software. So there's an email button on each report page, and you can click that, and then the report gets emailed directly to either you, the assessment taker, or other people you can specify. Could be the hiring manager. And then it's not stored on your computer, and it's not stored in your email program, Outlook, or whatever you use. Of course, if you email to an assessment taker, it's their data, so they can keep it forever. If you email to a hiring manager, you of course have to tell the hiring manager that they can't keep it forever. They have to delete it if it's a candidate who's not hired or an employee who leaves. So just to remind you that storing PI data outside PI software, you have to be mindful of where you do that and have some sort of process in place. So it could be just doing a search in your Outlook to see if you've emailed any reports and then making sure you delete them. And then use the email button. That's the easiest way for you to avoid storing a lot of data on your computer. So that was it for GDPR compliance. Very quick overview. We do have some guides available for you, some further resources that I will share with all of you on email. So we have a GDPR compliance guide that has a lot of the information I've gone through today. I'll also share the slides. We also have a 2-pager guide if you just want a quick overview of what you need to do in PI software to be GDPR compliant. And we have the guide I mentioned earlier that you as admins, software admins, can send out to other software users. You can specify how long you keep data and all that, and then send that to your software users so that they're informed of what process you've set up, what folder structure, and all these things. There are also some links on PI's website. So predictiveindex.com has a lot of information about how they are GDPR compliant, different terms, privacy, data processing agreement, and so on. And there's also a list of technical sub-processors. So for instance, PI software data is stored on a Microsoft server. Microsoft, of course, has to comply with all the same laws as PI does to be GDPR compliant. But there's a list of that if you're interested. If you have more questions about any of this, or if you have someone, a legal counsel in-house who has any more specific legal questions, any question related to GDPR, you're always welcome to contact us at gdpr@humanostics.com, and we will do our best to help you out. If it's a technical legal question, we may have to elicit the legal counsel at the Predictive Index, but they have actual lawyers there, so who can answer more technical questions for us. So that was it for today. I will stop the recording.